All right, let's talk Supreme Court nominations. In a speech just yesterday, Vice President Joe Biden took issue with the so-called Biden rule, calling it ridiculous. He criticized Senate Republicans for their lack of action on the matter. So what's your take on this? And I guess, Matt, you can go first.
Yeah, look, there's a number of Democrats that are total hypocrites now based on things they've said in the past. You can add Joe Biden to that list, Chuck Schumer, a number of other Democrats. You had 25 Senate Democrats try to prevent Samuel Alito from getting a vote when they voted for a filibuster just a few years ago during the Bush years. So, look, it's not about the nominee. It's about the process. People have been voting for president now for months. We're in an election year. A vacancy created in a presidential election year hasn't had a nominee confirmed since I think it's 80 years ago. So you can point to the Reagan years. 1988, Kennedy was the third choice. That was a vacancy created in 1987. Trust me, not since 80 years have we had a nominee confirmed when a vacancy was created in a presidential election year. We want to let the voters speak. That's all we want to do.
And the reason we haven't had that precedent in 80 years is because we have a precedent of Supreme Court justices not dying in election years. That's really what's at the precedent here. And when you look at what the American people want, they voted for President Obama twice. They voted for a Republican Senate. They voted for the lawmakers in place right now to make these decisions. When you poll the American public, the vast majorities, 2/3, say the president should make this decision and the Senate should take up the hearings. Look, we can talk about Democrats who have filibustered things in the past, but Republicans are in the majority. If they want to stop this, they can. The bottom line is they're not even letting it start. They're not even letting hearings happen. They talk about constitutional duty until it's time to exercise the duty, and then they are the one who are the hypocrites. They need to take up some responsibility here and do their jobs.
Matt, it seems like you have something to say.
I'm just going to say, the Senate's responsibility is to do whatever it wants. Advise and consent means they can consider a nominee or not consider a nominee. Do you know how I know that, Ed? Because for 2 years the Democrats didn't give Miguel Estrada a vote on the Senate floor, and he was nominated to the same court that Merrick Garland is on.
And then there was also the Gang of Seven back in 2005 where Democrats didn't want certain judges to go through, and then they brokered a deal. I remember it was Gang of 14. It was one of those Senate gangs that made it happen, and judges got in place. And a number of Bush appointees made it through. Look, it goes back and forth both times, but in all these cases with both parties, the bottom line is they get hearings and they get an up or down vote.
Miguel Estrada didn't get an up or down vote. And 25 Senate Democrats filibustered Samuel Alito. They didn't want to give him an up or down vote.
But there wasn't a vacancy on the Supreme Court for a year. He still got there. Bush still got his man. The country still got a full Supreme Court.
Well, that wasn't even an election year with Samuel Alito.
It doesn't matter if it's an election year or not. It's a third branch of government that is hobbled because one party is digging in its heels.
Today, demonstrations were held across the country, urging Republicans to, quote, do your job and give fair consideration to U.S. Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland. Here in Austin, demonstrators from Progress Texas and MoveOn.org gathered at Senator John Cornyn's office. On top of that, a plane flew overhead with a banner that said, Senator Cornyn, do your job, hashtag fill the seat. Now, Republican leadership has said any nomination from President Obama is essentially dead on arrival and that the next president should fill the opening on the Supreme Court. Joining us now to share their thoughts on this is the Executive Director of Progress Texas, Ed Espinoza, and GOP consultant Matt Makoviak. Thank you both for being here.
Sure.
All right, Matt, starting with you, why not give Judge Merrick Garland a fair hearing?
Well, the president has the constitutional right to nominate judges, and the Senate has the constitutional right to advise and consent. It's clear the Senate majority advised the president not to nominate someone. He certainly had the right to do it, but that they weren't going to take up a nomination in an election year, and that's what the historical precedent has been. It's been 80 years since a vacancy created in a presidential election year had a nomination and a confirmation that same year. We've already had voters voting, millions of people in about 20 states since February 1st. This is a decision the next president should make. It raises the stakes on the presidential election, and I don't understand why Democrats don't want voters in this election year to be able to make the decision about who the next president is and who that person can appoint, because we're talking about the swing seat essentially in the very narrow 5-4 majority in the Supreme Court. This would reshape the court for 40 or 45 years probably if a liberal were put on there as opposed to a conservative. So all Republicans are saying is let's wait 6 more months, let's let the election play out, and the next president can nominate the next Supreme Court justice.
So, Ed, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you think that Republicans are afraid that Merrick will be confirmed if he is allowed that hearing?
Well, I don't think that they're afraid that it'll be confirmed. I think the problem is they're just so stubborn about this that they don't even want to let the process play out. Look, the president has a constitutional duty to nominate judges. The Senate has a constitutional duty to go through the process, have the hearings, and then advise. They can't just advise to not do something. That's their job. Imagine if you or I or anybody watching just decided that they weren't going to do their job for 10 months. That wouldn't fly. In this case, it's not flying with the Republicans either. A new poll that came out today said that only 16% of the American people agree with Republicans to not have a hearing right now. 77% of the public says we have to have a hearing, including 62% of Republicans. Have the hearings, do your job, let's have an up or down vote. It's not a difficult question.
All right, Matt, Republican leaders say the next president should choose the Supreme Court nominee or the justice. Would that hold true if our current president had been a Republican?
Well, I mean, it's easy to say yes from my standpoint. Who knows? The politics would be reversed. And look, there is politics on both sides of this. But again, the historical precedent here is clear. Joe Biden, when he was Senate Judiciary Committee chairman, said at one time he didn't believe that they should take up Supreme Court nominations in presidential election years. Chuck Schumer, the incoming Senate Minority Leader for the Democrats, has had a similar view in the past. You know, Harry Reid has blocked consideration for judges like Miguel Estrada, who was up for the same court that Merrick Garland is on now, the second highest court in the land. So Democrats are reaping what they've sown. They've blocked justices nominated by Republican presidents in the last 10 years or so. And what's interesting is Harry Reid used the nuclear option to break down the filibuster when he was majority leader a few years ago, but he exempted the Supreme Court from that, and he did that because he knows the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land, and you've got to have bipartisan unity when it comes to nominees, and you wouldn't have that in this case. They're not doing an FBI background check. There's not going to be hearings. There may be a couple individual meetings with senators, but Merrick Garland is not going to be approved before the election.
Okay, Ed, quickly, we're almost out of time.
There's so many things wrong with what Matt said. First of all, the only historical precedent in not appointing Supreme Court justices in election year is they typically don't die in election years. But there was one confirmed in 1988 under President Reagan, and that wasn't that long ago. So there is some precedent there. And as far as dragging their feet, Democrats don't drag their feet on Supreme Court nominations. They at least get to a hearing. But as far as judges go, Texas has 11 federal judicial vacancies right now, more than any other in the country. And Ted Cruz and John Cornyn have been dragging their feet on these judicial confirmations, even nominations, for years. The Supreme Court delay is not new, and I think it's going to cost them down the road.
In 1988, that was the third nominee selected after Robert Bork was.
But it happened in an election year, and he was confirmed.
Happened the year before. Happened in 1987.
Gentlemen, we are absolutely out of time. But Ed, Matt, thank you both for sharing your perspectives with us tonight.